on unconventional structure in biography. The brainchild of Laure Ellis, second from the left here, who is the author of a forthcoming biography of Lucia Berlin called Looking for Lucia. To her right, your left, Howard Fishman, author of To Anyone Who Ever Asks, The Life, Music, and Mystery of Connie Converse, a book I highly recommend. If you haven't read it yet, listen to it because it's got the music in the audiobook, which is amazing. Here, Deborah Lutz, who has a brand new biography of Emily Bronte, congratulations, called This Dark Night, and also a wonderful earlier book, which is why I think you're part of this group, called The Bronte Cabinet, 3 Lives in 9 Objects, has a truly unconventional structure. And last but not least, Francesca, the latest winner of the Plutarch Award, author of 2 unconventional works of biography, Square Haunting, 5 Writers in London Between the Wars, and most recently, as we all know, Gertrude Stein and Afterlife. I'm going to let you look up their glowing biographies in your programs. You should look them up because they're all glowing. And I will add that I am here by virtue of my current project. My published work is pretty unexperimental, but I have earned my spot as moderator by virtue of the fact that I am currently working on a book about Rachel Carson that weaves in the lives of some of the 19th century women who preceded her as generators of wonder in the natural world. I'm practicing the art of meander in narrative nonfiction. So first I'm going to ask each of you to spend 5 minutes introducing the work that brought you here today. Howard, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Thanks so much, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming to the panel. In 2010, I was at a holiday party, and I heard a song come up on the playlist, and I couldn't place the singer, the style, the period, anything about it, except it felt to me as though a song that I'd known all my life. And I found the host of the party to ask him who this was that we were listening to, and he said, "Oh, this is Connie Converse. She recorded these songs in the 1950s. She never had a real career, and then one day she drove away in her Volkswagen Bug and was never heard from again. And these recordings that she made in her apartment in Greenwich Village had just been discovered and put out on a little label. And I didn't believe any of that. So I never heard of Connie Converse before. The whole story sounded very fantastic to me. I went home that night, I got online to Google her. There was nothing about anybody named Connie Converse, except for this little record that had just come out. Nothing about any performances that she had given in the 1950s, no reviews of any of her music, and nothing about a missing person that had disappeared. Nothing. It's almost like she didn't exist. And that led me to contacting, I was not a writer at that time, I was a musician, a full-time musician. But I was seized by the mystery of why this woman had left no footprint at all, combined with the brilliance of the music that I was listening to, which seems, I couldn't believe how good it was. So I contacted her family, I contacted her surviving brother, we started corresponding. He invited me out to his house in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And once he understood that I was very serious about discovering more about his sister, he said, "Come out here, I've got all of Connie's stuff in my garage, everything that she left behind." And there I encountered a filing cabinet, a 5-drawer filing cabinet that contained the remnants of, it wasn't just a random collection of bric-a-brac, it was an immaculately cataloged, curated compendium of this person's life. Who was not only a musician but a polymath. She was a ferocious intellectual, she was a visual artist. She did all kinds of amazing things, and she left behind hundreds and hundreds of letters and photographs and diary entries and projects. And it was at that point that I realized I was going to have to write a book. And 12 years later, that's the book that I wrote.
Hi everyone. One of the lovely things about getting to propose panels for Bio is that you get to bring together writers you admire I also just want to thank Karen Rothman. I'm not sure if she's here, but I was in correspondence with her throughout the proposal of the panel process, and she was super, super helpful. My book is actually not coming out for a year, so I'm not used to talking about it publicly, so forgive me, I've written a little blurb which I'll read to you to make sure I don't go over 5 minutes. So my name is Laure Ellis, and I'm the first biographer of the peripatetic American short story writer Lucia Berlin, who was born in 1936 and died in 2004. My book, Looking for Lucia, a biography in motion, comes out in June 2027, so in almost exactly a year, from Paris Strauss, and it is formally experimental. While it tells the story of Berlin's life, of course, that biographical narrative is interwoven with my account of my 3-month-long journey in search of Berlin, tracking down her many homes in 17 cities across the USA, Mexico, and Chile in chronological order. So I started in Alaska, where she was born, and then went to Texas, and Chile, and back to Albuquerque in this sort of spider diagram. My travels were part of my biographical quest, of course, but they were also an exercise in empathy, in seeing the world as Berlin saw it, and in evoking her aesthetic of dislocation, which is present throughout all of her short stories, by retracing her displacements myself. I should say, Lucia Berlin wrote only short stories. They were published during her lifetime, and then posthumously published after her death, and became a New York Times bestseller in 2015 for FSG. Berlin's writing invites this immersive method. Her short stories are autofictions, written decades before that now trendy term was coined. And they transform her lived experiences on the page. So she's quite an interesting person to write a biography on. So my source material determined my experimental approach. I consciously chose to pay homage to Berlin's approach to writing by following her lead in incorporating an account of my own travels and experiences into my story and the story of her life, so that the form my biography takes is itself a kind of reading or analysis of Berlin's approach to fiction. Her approach encourages me also to see myself as a character in my book about her, the biographer detective on a transcontinental quest, exhausted by the end and obsessed, looking for the ghost of a woman she's never met. So I was following her lead. And the book is called Looking for Lucia, and if you're interested in hearing about it when it comes out, and in the lead up to it coming out, you can just look up Looking for Lucia Substack, and I have a free Substack newsletter, so please sign up.
Hi, my book, The Bronte Cabinet, came out of my deep interest in old objects. So I really love antiques and vintage clothing and anything that's old houses, these things. And I had been doing a lot of research for some previous books in archives, looking at objects, looking at the personal possessions of a collection of writers, right? So portable desks and clothing, jewelry in particular. And so I kind of thought it would be really interesting to try to write a biography focusing on the objects, the personal possessions that were owned by subjects. So I met with my editor, talked to her, and we decided that Brontes would be a great family or collection of people to write about. So I wrote about the 3 sisters, not the entire family. And so each chapter actually begins with a particular personal object, like a walking stick, or, as I said, a portable desk, an album of pressed ferns, and etc. Hair jewelry, morning jewelry with a dead person's hair in it. And so for each chapter, I talk about the way that that particular object fits into the life of the person I'm talking about. But I also spend a lot of time talking about the history of the object, right? So for the walking stick chapter, I talk about the history of walking and the history of walking sticks, and who are famous walking sticks, and what it meant to be a walker in the 19th century, which is really different from what it means to be a walker today. So it was really fun, and it was my first entrance into doing archival research because I received my PhD, but I was never trained to do archival research, and I found it really intimidating. And so my first 2 books, I didn't do any archival research, but once I sort of thought about objects and I realized I could go go to the New York Public Library research branch and I could look at a lock of hair that had once been on George Eliot's head. I got really excited by that, and I was able to go to a bunch of archives and look at objects. But once I started doing that, I realized that, and then I realized I could actually look at manuscripts as well. And that was the thing that I found really intimidating. Didn't really know how to approach. But once I started seeing the objects, I started looking at manuscripts, and I began to realize that there are just so many manuscripts that have not been looked at, even for major figures, right? So I then recently finished an Emily Bronte biography, and a lot of that came out of this realization that most Bronte scholars had not looked at her manuscripts, and probably no one had looked at all of them. So I went around. I mean, they're spread out. That's why no one has seen them. And there are like 10 different archives in 2 different countries. So but I had the time. I was lucky to have the time and the resources to go look at all of them and touch them and handle them and look at the doodles and study the folds in the paper, which I think are important, and the way that they're ripped out and the way they're only like this big. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I'm encouraging people to go into the archive and look at go to the archive. There's things there that you would never imagine. Even if you're writing about a major figure, you're going to find manuscripts and objects that people haven't talked about.
These are all such fascinating projects, and it's lovely to be understand them. I guess I'm interested in writers who write about themselves, and Stein is such a inveterate self-mythologizer. And I guess something that I'm interested in with someone is the kind of gap, I guess, between the public presentation of self, like self-construction, and the kind of more private story, or these alternative stories that can be told through looking at them from different perspectives and perhaps probing the gaps in their own narratives and wondering what's left out and why. And Stein's self-mythology is most famously propounded in her book, The Autobiography of Alice Butopolis, the story of Stein, seen through the eyes of her partner, which enables Stein, of course, to say things like Gertrude Stein is a genius. And I think Stein wrote that book and became a huge sensation. It's kind of impossible to even imagine the level of celebrity that she achieved. She came over to America for a promotional tour, and her name was up in lights in Times Square. But she was always frustrated that she was known for her personality and rather than really for the real writing. The autobiography, in a way, was served as a kind of advertisement for herself, I think, in a hope that people, that readers and publishers would be drawn back to the work, that the radical writing that she considered her greatest achievement and that she was convinced would be the bedrock of her legacy. And in fact, in 1926, so 100 years ago, she gave a lecture in which she made the case that truly kind of new groundbreaking work in art or in literature won't be appreciated in its own time because tastes take a while to catch up. And I think she was in a way anticipating that her readers would come, at a time in the future where she might not even be around to see them, but that they would find her work and find it generative as long as the work survived. And Stein, in a way, really is a posthumous author, I think, because at her death, her reputation was very checkered. Not much of her work was in print. Many of her books, of her published works before the autobiography, had been self-published or had appeared piecemeal in little magazines, or were unread in her filing cabinets, which Alice Butopolis kept so carefully. But Stein had the idea, recently, that sending her papers to an institution would help ensure her posterity. So she had sent huge swathes of suitcases to Yale with the idea that her work would live there, kind of waiting for people to find it. My starting point for this book was reading Janet Malcolm's book, Two Lives, part of which tells the story of Leon Katz, a graduate student at Columbia who went to the Stein archive a couple of years after it had opened, having to write a dissertation on Stein's early work. He found there a tranche of notebooks which didn't seem to have been looked at by anyone at all, which looked to him almost like a key to her novel, The Making of Americans, full of names he didn't recognize from the autobiographies, full of diagrams and kind of notes to self and notes on the people in her circle, the Catsonities and everyone. And he saw this opportunity and got in touch with Alice B. Toklas, who lived on for 20 years after Stein died, and she had been reluctant to talk to biographers, and then very quickly after Stein died, a few biographers had got in touch with her, and she was frustrated that they wanted really to write kind of gossipy chronicles of, of Bohemian Paris, but she was interested in Katz because of his interest in Stein's work, and Katz spent months interviewing Toklas about her life with Stein, and then never published the book that he had promised. And this is where Janet Malcolm picks up the story, and she speaks to various Stein scholars who are all sort of frustrated that they feel the field has kind of ground to a halt while they're waiting for this material, which one person is sort of holding on to. And I guess Malcolm, is interested in what, in how knowledge, how sort of if knowledge is protected, or if you can only know the answer to a story when one person who has this privileged information sees fit to reveal it, and there's no way of fact checking what the young cat said. He become this sort of figure in the Stein world where other scholars had to ask him, did Alice say anything about this, and he could, sort of say what he wanted. And Katz died in 2017, and his papers went to the Biographical. And so after I read Malcolm's book, I just wondered what had happened to him and saw that they were there. And so I think I went there really at first with the thought of just writing, sort of almost finishing the question that Malcolm posed. But I guess from there it grew into this a sort of interrogation of biography, and my book is structured in two halves: the kind of life, Stein's life, as in a way as she told it, followed by the part, the afterlife, which follows Toklas's role as sort of gatekeeper to the Stein estate, and in a way, and through Katz's research and other events, sort of undercuts or sort of, I hope, deepens the story that the first half told.
Wow. Well, Francesca, you sort of answered this question already, but by the time we come back to you, maybe you'll have more to say about it. So there's a chicken and egg question here. You find a subject, you're fascinated by that subject, you want to write about that subject, or do you want to write an unconventional biography and you look for an unconventional subject? I'm curious about which came first, the fascination with a figure that dictated the unusual form, or the interest in an unusual form. And once you've finished answering that, I'm curious to know, did you have any struggle to convince your publisher, or any publisher, to go for it?
I was not looking for Connie-Combers. Connie-Combers found me, is what I always say, and I just felt that I had a mission, and that was to write the book. And the second question was about convincing a publisher, that was not easy to do. And my initial idea was to write a soup to nuts, cradle to grave biography. No publisher would touch that, because nobody knew who Connie-Combers was. So that's when I sort of reimagined or restructured my book in the unconventional way that it came out, which was inserting myself into the narrative and having the book be kind of a detective story of finding her.
For me, absolutely, my interest in Lucia Berlin, who I've come to think of as Lucia, my friend, came first. I did my PhD at Cambridge, quite a conventional PhD on Berlin, and then got the contract and started thinking about how I would adapt this into a trade book. And as a writer myself, so I was originally a short story writer before I discovered Lucia, wrote my master's thesis on her, got a scholarship, ended up doing a PhD on her. I sort of feel like she chose me as well, and sort of guided this path of my life. As a short story writer myself, I suppose I kind of thought it might be interesting to try to empathize with, imitate, play with her writing style, and I suppose that then kind of fed into my approach to the biography. Also, obviously, she moved frequently, and I was going to have to visit these places anyway. in which her narrator says she's mourning the death of a mother, and she said visiting Paris. And she says, I felt sad about Bruno and my parents, not sad because I missed them, but because I really didn't. And when I died, it would be the same. Dying is like shattering mercury. Soon it all just flows back together into the quivering mass of life. And I really found, as I researched first my master's and my PhD, and then carried on into this biography, I found that I was fascinated by the community that it left behind, and incorporating the first person. I mean, my book is not about me at all, it's about my search for Lucia, partly, but of course maybe it's the story of her life. Incorporating that first person allowed me to write kind of portraits of her family, her friends, her editors, this really interesting community in the Bay Area that published her work, experimental, small publishing world. And I feel like I hope that she would have appreciated that, because I think she saw herself and her identity as part of that community.
As I sort of mentioned before, my interest was first in the objects. And I was lucky I already have a publisher who wanted me to write my second trade book. And so we kind of talked about what that would look like and how I could use objects to tell someone's story, basically. So it was really the archival act of looking at these intimate objects and my interest in them that led to me deciding to write in this way. But it was kind of fun because it really did happen that I was like sitting with my editor and my agent at the time, and we were having a conversation about what I should write about. And I said, I love the Brontes. Can I write about the Brontes? And they said, yes, of course. There's always people who are interested in the Brontes, right? Because the Brontes are major figures. And so that was kind of the permission that I got to get to write about the Brontes and write about the objects. And I do think that, that's I think one reason why writing about a major figure I think is worth doing if anyone is thinking of doing that or has done that and won't do it again. But secondly, there's something really wonderful and sort of enlivening about looking at the personal possessions and thinking about what haunts them or what did they witness. I mean, I don't really believe that objects are alive, but there is a sense that, when we look at an old desk, there's like these scratches and marks, and you can think about where those marks came from. And in terms of the Brontes portable desks, there are ink stains, and you can sort of trace the way that their hands went to the ink bottle, and then they dripped ink down, and they were writing on the velvet slope. And so there are things to be found, I think, in the researching of material objects.
I think actually I was first interested in writing a sort of unconventional biography or a biography that kind of probed the form. I think my first book was a group biography of 5 women who were connected by the coincidence that they had all happened to live in the same square in London at different times, and it was in the course of researching that I discovered the various connections, personal and thematic, between them. But researching 5 different people, they all had, each one was a totally different experience, because on the one hand I had Virginia Woolf, who left an enormous amount of material in her diaries and her letters. You can see practically what she was doing every day, whereas Jane Harrison and Diane Power destroyed their papers, or others destroyed their papers for them, so there was much less material to work with. And then the poet H.P., the period I was writing about, her life during the First World War, she wrote about in fiction over and over again throughout her life, writing the same story but kind of changing the emphasis, transposing the events and the characters to different settings. And she wrote a final version of this novel about 40 years later after analysis with Freud, which, does that bring up, is that version truer than the version that she wrote at the time when events were raw, because she's processed it in some way, or, where there were some versions of the story foregrounded a lesbian relationship, and others were more focused on a heterosexual relationship, and, again, it just sort of brings up all these questions, I guess, of, what kind of truth, how possibly as a biographer could you amalgamate all of those different versions into one linear narrative and say this is how it was. It's impossible. And so I guess that had led me to want a new subject who, through whom they could sort of dramatize some of those questions. And Stein presented a really fascinating case study in biography as someone who thought so much about her archive and her legacy. And Alice B. Topless presented a fascinating character as a steward and a legacy who had her own, who led her own life with Stein and then led this sort of second life, kind of serving the memory of her partner, as she sort of served her own life. So actually, that was where I started, but actually, it was Stein's work that drew me in more and more over the course of the book, and the book ended up expanding from its origins, really, because I became more and more fascinated by the subject, but that wasn't necessarily so from the beginning.
A rare case of going from a conventional biography backward, or from an unconventional biography back to a conventional one. So for everybody who was here for our wonderful plenary this morning, Brenda Wineapple and Ron Turner had some opinions about the use of the first person. And two of you, Howard and Nina, are, who are in the narrative. They are in search of books. They are quest narratives, and you are the quester and the questioner. Deborah and Francesca, as Brenda Wineapple said, you're not using the first person pronoun except for the very end, but your points of view are guiding the story nonetheless. What are your opinions about the use of the first person in conventional and unconventional biography? Anybody?
Do you want to start down there this time?
Whoever wants to jump in.
I'll jump in. I don't usually use the first person, except for maybe in like a preface or an introduction. I think in the preface to the Bronte Cabinet, I use the first person. And I talk a little bit about my own research and my own archival research. But I think I guess I don't do it because I was trained as an academic, and I mean, some academics do use the first person, but it's much less common in academia. But weirdly, I feel like obviously my interests are always the thing that causes me to write what I write, right? And so in that sense, I think all my writing is really personal, and this new biography of Emily Bronte, I feel like it's so personal in the sense that I was able to figure out what her obsessions were and what my obsessions were, and we shared a lot of obsessions, and so there was a way that I focused on those things, right? I think that's true of a lot of biography, especially more intense and, I don't know, brooding and searching types of biographies, is that you really get to understand what the writer is interested in, right, in a sense, yeah.
Yes, that was very interesting this morning. I wanted to stand up and say, no, sometimes it's good. I think, yes, I do use the first person. And I think using the first person is not the same thing as writing about yourself or making it about yourself. For me, I think it came from the fact that actually my undergraduate degree was in anthropology, social anthropology, and it's a common practice in ethnography to sort of have a disclaimer at the beginning of an ethnographic text in which you explain your biases so that when the reader goes on to encounter the rest of your research, they know what lens you're seeing it through. And so, and I know this is very controversial, I think influenced by that, I sort of think that using the first person either throughout the book, as we have done, or in prologues, as you have done, and epilogues, I kind of think it's more honest, because it gives your reader a sense of how you're telling the story, and of the you're making the choices that you're making transparent. And in a way, it gives your reader agency, power. It's a way of showing respect to the reader, because it allows them to make their own decision. And you're sort of saying this is not the final story by incorporating your account and your research. And also it's nice because it allows you to kind of easily, for example, Lucia Lynn has many gaps in her archives, and I'm a biographer, and she's not very well known. There are some situations in which multiple stories could be told, and as with all lives, of course, and it allows me to kind of mediate between those stories and then leave the reader to decide on their, takeaway perspective.
I didn't have too much to say. I guess I was just, when you were speaking, thinking about Stein's first biographer, Elizabeth Sprigg, who really fell foul of Alice P. chocolates. She came along with flowers to interview her and probably said, I haven't read any of Gertrude Stein's writing. Alice P. chocolates at first sort of took it on herself to sort of educate her, and then just got totally fed up and wrote incredibly vituperate letters. And the biography is, Sprigg worked incredibly hard and actually travelled around interviewing people, and she wrote a journal of her, it's actually called In Search of Gertrude Stein, which is at the Beinecke, and it's actually much more interesting than her book, because her book, she I think she was scared of chocolates, and she really, it's essentially regurgitates the autobiography, and doesn't include a lot of stuff that people told her that she had been worried would upset chocolates or something. But the journal of her research is just kind of electric, because there she is, meeting all these people who Stein knew, who are keen to settle scores, and some of them are suspicious of her, and some of them welcome her in, and I just found that really fascinating to read, and it's in the first person. It wasn't intended for publication, but yeah, I think that chimes with what you said and with your approach.
My book, my editor told me from the very beginning, and I should say that, I said I worked on the book for 12 years. 10 and a half of those years were on spec. I didn't know whether I was ever going to publish this book. And when I finally did find a publisher, he said, you've got to be the reader's Virgil. You've got to take us through the story. That's the only way this book is going to work. Because there's so much that we don't know, no one will ever know about your subject. So that has to be accounted for and talked about and contextualized and explained. So, for me, I just tried to do it as honestly as I could. And I always said to my editor, the only thing that I'm concerned about is I never want to take attention away from my subject. So if I am ever in any way doing that, stealing the spotlight from her, just keep me honest, because that can't ever happen.
So chronology is sort of the most traditional approach to the cradle to grave. No matter how unconventional you are, you cannot escape chronology if you're elaborating on life. So, and I think in literary biography especially, that becomes you're mediating between the story that you're telling and the story that your subject is telling in their work, and working between those two modes. So all of you obviously use chronology. How did you play with it?
Okay, I'll start. I didn't really, I had a very hard time organizing my book, actually. It was really, really hard. I went through so many outlines. I look at the outlines, and I had all these notebooks full of outlines. It was so hard, because I was taking an object, I did it chronologically. I was writing about 3 different people. It was chronological, but each chapter was about an object. And yeah, it was really difficult. I don't know. Oh, thank you. I think that even when, I'll just say this was a conversation that some of us were having last night at the reception, but that even when you are writing chronologically, no matter what, you have to do a lot of organizing. Those of you who've written biographies know what I'm talking about. So I feel like chronology can be a crutch to lean on, but there's still so much work that you have to do to organize within the chronology. I guess I'll say that.
I'm happy to go next. It was so funny actually, I was just rereading Francesca's wonderful book on the plane on the way over, and you quote, I'm sure you can remember this quote, I'm going to butcher it, but you quoted her talking about detective novels and saying that they were the most modern form of novel because the deed has already been done, the person's already dead before it begins. Well, obviously I felt very, that made me think of the process of writing a biography, of course, in my case anyway. I certainly felt like a detective a lot of the time, and so I intentionally started with Lucy Ellen's death, so I have a prologue of her death, and me sort of in search of her, and moving back and forth between a past tense account of her life, and in this case starting with her death, and a present tense account of me talking my way into the apartment that she lived in, so the last place that she lived. And and then I go back to the beginning and move forwards through her life and also my journey in search of her, which I just took in chronological order, so starting with where she was born and so forth, even when it didn't make any geographical sense. So like I was going from like New York to the west coast of Mexico to Albuquerque to Mexico, back to Albuquerque, so I sort of tried to do a detective novel thing. So when I came across that in Francesca's book, I was like, yes, time would have approved. And then apart from that, I just moved back and forth between the present and the past tense in order to distinguish between her life, which is probably 70% of the book, her biographical story, and then the sort of 30%, which is the account of my interviews and my journey, how I've come to her.
Yeah, I think structure is just so hard, and I think balancing the chronology, within I guess an unconventional kind of holder. I think it's just such a challenge, and I went through lots of drafts to try to get that right, because ultimately chronology is helpful, I think, for a reader to know where we are, know what's happening next, know where we are in the life. And I think in my first sort of iteration of this book, I didn't want to mention anything in the first half that sort of was found in the archive and revealed after Stein's death. But then it meant that I was in effect often telling the same story twice, but the second time I was kind of saying, remember what I told you before, there's actually stuff I didn't tell you. And that didn't really work, because I think it would leave the reader either feeling, why didn't you tell us before, or possibly not remembering, or was I meant to know that, and I did something. And so I ultimately ended up really putting most of the narrative back into the first half, and then what I was showing in the second half was, in a way, other people who came to the archive making discoveries which changed what they knew about Stein, but hopefully the reader sort of had the full picture in the first half, but in a way the perspective shifts, I guess. There's a kind of zoning out, and Stein is no longer there, she's no longer a character. She's a ghostly figure who is being reanimated and fought over, and reassembled from what she's left behind.
Sure. Yeah. Briefly, for me, I gave away the ending at the beginning. You have to. She disappeared, and then I just tried to tell it organically in terms of how I was finding out about the information, almost chronologically. Parallel to telling the story of her life. And this secondary thing for me was the brother that I contacted initially. His name was Philip Converse, who's a celebrated political scientist. He's now passed away. But his story and his relationship to his sister became kind of a secondary story through line that I had to continue to tell and circle back to as I was telling her story.
I'm just struck by what Francesca was just saying about discovering via one draft that a different structure would be better. How many times did that happen to you all? Did you set out with a structure in mind that worked, or did you scrap it over and over?
I think for me it was a chapter by chapter situation. Because my book only has like 9 chapters. It's been a while since I looked at it. I think it's about 9 or 10 chapters, which I don't think is very good chapters for a biography. And so with each chapter I had to continue I wrote many drafts of each chapter, and then there was going back and revising earlier drafts. I don't know, I'm not a person who writes a million drafts, so I think for me it was just redrafting was the way that I was able to hammer out the structure.
I'm also someone who writes by redrafting many times, but my structure never changed. So I always knew that it would be a chapter. Lucinda made it easy for me, only structurally, not in any other way. Like moving frequently, so she lived in over 200 homes, and I travelled to 17 cities all around the US, Mexico, and Chile, and I knew that it would be one chapter per place. And then often multiple houses on set, go to houses, and her life story is woven into that within each chapter. And I also liked that idea that she was a short story writer, and it allowed me to look at her life in some pieces, which became a way of exploring her short form.
Well, so were there other works by other biographers inspired you to think outside the box? Let's have a little reading list for our people who are interested in unconventional structure.
Well, the quest for Corvo is obviously the originator of the search narrative. You mentioned it.
Yeah. Say it again. Say it again with the other.
The quest for Corvo.
Simons or Simmons? Is that how you say his last name? A.J. Simons?
Yes, yeah. And then of course you have, In Search of Salinger, the Hamilton book, which makes his very difficult biographical process transparent. You have Sheer Rage, which was mentioned I think this morning, the Jack Dyer, which is wonderful. I feel like reading those works made me feel like I had permission to do something a bit unusual. I also personally really enjoyed my autobiography of Castle the Colours by Jen Chapman. I don't think I'll have an experience about it, but I really enjoyed it. And also, honestly, Francesca's first book, because her second book hasn't come out yet, by just starting with a square, with a place in London, sort of inspired me. I also really like Judith Freeman's The Long Embrace, Raymond Chandler and the Woman He Loved, which kind of goes around LA tracking down all of his answers. Yeah, lots of different books.
There's been a lot of books that have been biographies that have been written from the point of view of objects. I mean, not a lot, but there was a few. There's a really wonderful Jane Austen one by Paula Byrne, am I saying her last name correctly, that does something kind of similar to what mine does, but it's much longer. It's much more of a conventional biography, but at the beginning of each chapter she focuses briefly on some Jane Austen object. So I recommend that.
I guess Janet Malcolm is kind of my lone star, and I mean, in a way, my book was sort of started in response to sort of writing back to, in many ways, her book Two Lives, but her book The Silent Woman about Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes is the original Afterlife book. And I've been reading a lot more of her writings on biography kind of more broadly recently, and she's so skeptical of it, and yet she's always drawn back to it. And I do think that some of the problems she identifies with sort of many biographies are really interesting to kind of think with.
The other book that I'll mention is when I was getting all this pushback from agents and publishers about nobody knows who this woman is, how can you write about her? I read The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, and that became my argument for why I could write about somebody about whom nothing was known and nobody knew about.
A book that broke all the rules and then made new ones.
I just want to recommend, while I have a microphone, speaking of biographies of people who are not very well known, I really recommend Iman Mersal's Traces of a Naiad, which has been translated from the Arabic. It's really good. And it's the story of an Egyptian novelist who died, I think, in the 1960s, very young. And Mersal is a fantastic poet, and sort of writes essentially a portrait of Cairo as she sort of looks for Inayat al-Zayat. The novelist. So I really recommend it. It's from Transit Books. You can watch Transit Books in California, I think. So that's a great Egyptian poet writing about a great Egyptian novelist.
And Sadia Hartman's very large people experiments as well. Idea of kind of filling in the gaps, and all their archives are silent or telling a story of someone as seen through hostile lens, and sort of imagining an alternative life. Also, Lisa Cohen's book, All We Know, I love, and I think people pass that book around and recommend it to each other.
And as dessert, I would highly recommend Ian McEwan's new novel, not that new, What We Can Know. Right? What We Can Know. It's one of those novels that biographers, it's for us, it really is. And it also has an unconventional structure. So that's dessert. So, given I'm going to throw in one more question before we open it up to yours. Given the global diminishing attention span, where do you see biography going in the future? I had this wonderful masterclass this spring reading all 4 of these biographies, and in 2 cases listening, which is something I am increasingly excited about as a way of consuming biography, especially in Howard's case, where you're writing about a musician and the music is incorporated into the audio, which is an incredibly special way of experiencing a biography. It really is almost like a virtual reality. what is the unconventional structure panel at Bio going to look like in 10 years, 20 years?
I think that's really hard to answer, but I'll just jump in and just say one thing that I kind of, as with Francesca's book Square Hunting, I think that place will continue to be really important because we still go to places. We live in places. So it's sort of a sense of the concrete and the physical at home. I feel like that's going to continue to be really important and should continue to be really important.
It's going to be difficult when writing. I've never written about someone who had an email address or who texted, and that's going to just totally change the kind of material that's available. And also, probably a lot will be lost because people lose their phones or change their email addresses, but also it just is this incredible mass of potential material that would be way more than that you could possibly even 500 boxes of the minor key you could sort of get through. But I don't know, it may mean that it's just impossible to even pretend that you're doing anything approaching something that's comprehensive, and may lead to more sort of smart, wise looks or
Yeah, I agree with those points, and I think sort of picking up on what Francesca just said, I think especially writing about, as you say, people with email addresses, eventually people with social media accounts, I think biography will become more and more a process of selection amidst a huge mass of information. But of course that's only if you're writing about people who are recently, relatively recent subjects. I'm not sure what would you think.
I have no idea.
Well, on that note, do we have questions from people who are struggling with their own unconventional structures? I really wanted to make sure there was enough time. I think if you do, come down to the mics on the sides. Now we've explained, oh good.
I love all this creativity we're hearing about, and writing a biography is always a lot of learning by doing, and you're trying these new things, but the whole flip side is trying to sell it. And I just wonder what kinds of reactions are you getting, editors and agents and the whole picture, because you've obviously found a formula that works, or maybe it's accident or a combination, but could you address that?
I was lucky in that my publisher was very supportive. FSG also published Berlin, and I think they understood what I was trying to do with the sort of homage to. I really need to learn to pronounce homage, but I'm going to say it constantly after the book comes out, to her writing style. But I have to admit, I'm slightly terrified by what's going to happen when the book is published. I hope that biographers don't hate it. So please be supportive. Write nice things about it.
I guess, Stein in a way is such a famous person that most people have some sense of her or recognize the name or know something about her. So I guess that sort of helps to place it in a certain way. But it's been interesting in a way in sort of somewhat following the coverage in my book how often people don't even mention the structure, and sometimes reviews or even events that I've done kind of run through her life, and sort of almost wanted to reassemble a conventional kind of cradle-to-grave structure. So
What about your first book, with Square Haunting, which was really 5 biographies in one? What was the response? Did people get it, or did you find yourself having to re-explain what you were trying to do?
People got it, which is gratifying. And I guess that was the challenge to explain it, or to make those. Yeah, that's more of the need to make the case of why this is a book. And that was definitely a structural question that I thought a lot about in the edits, how to make sure that it doesn't feel like 5 separate chapters, but that it feels like one coherent, thing. So I think, in a way that was, something that I had to spend a lot of time thinking about and working out, and then, I trust that would come across.
Over here and then over here?
I wasn't looking. I'll leave it to the honor system. Yes.
Okay, this was wonderful. As a historian, moment through that sort of genre. And I want to mention the book, my autobiography of Cars and Colors by Jan Chaplin. So I'm just curious if other genres of music, for example, I'm writing about a blues singer. So I'm thinking about even using the blues as, as a sort of narrative form, alternative form of telling that particular story. So I'm just interested in what other inspirations have you drawn on from other genres, fields, etc.
I feel like with my book, I was thinking about walking into a museum. Walking into a museum and you see all these objects on display and you read the wall text. So for me that was kind of a little bit of an underlying, something I was thinking about as I was writing it. For my newer book that just came out recently, the Emily Bronte biography, I was thinking about the senses a lot, like the sense of smell and sounds, and so what sounds would she be hearing, what would she be seeing, what would she be smelling, and then feeling along the skin, like how cold would she be. So I think there was I don't know if that sort of, I don't know if that's cinematic or what that is exactly, but so just kind of sense of embodiment, like thinking about the body and how the body might feel in certain situations.
I just wanted to say, I think that sounds amazing as a structural device. And it's one of those cool things where it sounds like it emerges from the work. So the form itself sort of becomes part of the biography and a reflection on the work. I love it, can't wait to read it.
Yeah, I think, and just to jump in, I'm always looking to Rebecca Solnit as a guide for non-linear nonfiction. She has a wonderful essay entitled The Art of the Meander, or In Praise of the Meander. It's on LitHub, you can just Google her name and that title. And the idea of a walk through a body of knowledge. And you, as the guide, whether you're using the first person pronoun or not, your gaze resting on things that are sparkly to you, and making a story out of that attracts me a lot.
And I think ideas about structure and voice and form can come from surprising places. I watched Citizen Kane quite early in my Stein project, and that was really formative actually in thinking about it. It sort of starts with that newsreel, and he's dead, and people are talking about who was he, who was this person, and there's all these headlines, and that really spurred me to think about about starting with Stein dead, people, and she's already a contested figure, these obituaries are coming out, and people are talking about her just as, her legacy is in a way sort of fading and cementing. So yeah, that was, a surprising, that leisure time that turns into crucial work time.
And it's actually beautiful in your audiobook as well, because in that moment in the narrative, you've added some multimedia kind of audio, an audio soundscape of many voices speaking at once, which is very evocative and a little bit more dimensional than words on the page can be. Yes?
Just kind of process of writing question, but I realize everyone's process is different, but when it's cradle to grave, at least you kind of know what sequence your chapters are going to go in. And I'm just interested in knowing, for all of you approaching different structures and such, how much do you feel like you nailed it in your head as you were going? How much involved an editor coming in and helping you to piece together the sequencing of things? And just sort of what that process was like when you're not kind of dedicated to the kind of sequential storytelling.
I find, this is maybe just me, but I've never had an editor that was that, I don't know if the word is helpful or intrusive. I've never had an editor who would do that for me. It's like up to me, and then she might not like what I do, and then she might say to do something differently. But I've always had to do it on my own, and then had feedback. Haven't had that.
Well, my editor was, I had a great editor at Dutton. And he was very good about asking me to expand at certain points when I would get sort of off the beaten track. He would sometimes say, well, let's actually hear a little bit more about that. So if anything, the editor that I had allowed me to be even more expansive than I felt like I was allowed to be, which I feel very grateful for.
Yeah, my editor is very helpful too. I think in reacting to the book as a reader, who hasn't spent years immersed in the Stein archives and who isn't necessarily, automatically as interested in the subject as we all are. And I think, I get so into research and want the narrative to be rigorous. Sometimes I can probably put more detail in than is necessary. And so I think an editor or a reader, a friend is helpful in winnowing out, what is necessary and what is interesting, and to someone coming to the story for the first time. And sorting out, I guess, what's a rabbit hole that could be a footnote or could just be a memory for the biographer versus what is really, really important. So I think that's a perspective that you can't have for yourself. But there's a lot that I've got around lots, just working out the structure on my own too.
But that's just memory for the biographer. Also, I find that difficult. I was really lucky with my editors. So my main editor is Jonathan Galassi, and he did sort of a structural edit, and then my sort of close line edits have been his assistant, Una Holohan. So I had a kind of macro and then micro approach. It's been amazing. I couldn't have done it without them. It hasn't occurred to me going into this that not every chapter had to have the same proportion of me, or my journey, it's not really me, versus Lucia. So there are some chapters where I have loads of material, I'm interviewing tons of people about her, and I almost disappear, my journey is not so conspicuous. And then there's a chapter in Chile, for example, where there's absolutely no archival evidence. There's one person that I could interview, and that was it. And so it was very much about my search for remnants and traces of her life in Chile. And yeah, Jonathan really helped me. I mean, it sounds so obvious now, but he said, that chapter could be 50-50 and another chapter could be 90-10. So that was really helpful.
This is a question for Nina. If I understood correctly, and it is after all the afternoon of a long day, you said that your travels are based chronologically on her life, which meant you zigzagged all over the place. That would have been a lot more expensive than doing it geographically.
Yes, it did.
Why was it so important that you did it that way? Because biography is, one has to look at margin.
Absolutely. And I love talking about, money and art. So I'm so glad that you bring that. I absolutely couldn't have done the journey without my book advance. So I spent the entire first portion of my book advance on it. So the journey, which was just over 2 months, cost just over $10,000, which I think was very cheap for 17 cities across 3 continents and 3 countries. I was just really committed to the structure as a way of telling the story, essentially, of her life. And when I wrote the book proposal to FSG, I said that I wanted them to cover the journey. And so that was incorporated into my advance. It meant that I didn't make any money from the book. I also travelled in an extremely, kind of sparing way. So Spirit Airlines was still alive and well at the time. I spent over 2 months living out of, because I didn't want to pay for the hold luggage, out of a tiny carry-on gigs. I had 1 pair of shoes, which were absolutely disgusting by the end. I hadn't washed any of my clothes. I stayed in hostels in dorm groups in hostels. I remember, I think it was in Santa Monica, I stayed in the hostel where a woman had just been drafted, or maybe it was in San Diego, into the Navy. Yeah, it was in San Diego. And so she'd get up at 5 a.m. every day and wake us all up with her alarm. So it was tough. But I think I was so committed to the structure and the chronology and the dislocation I knew I would feel. I knew I'd be exhausted. I knew I'd feel thrown off balance by the end. And I wanted that because it felt like a part of the way of telling the story. But yes, you're right. It was kind of crazy. Yes.
Last question.
Thank you. Terrific session. who were there when he learned? Why did he call me aside to talk about it? Any suggestions about how to do the first person without suddenly late in the story become intrusive?
I love the first person. I don't know, I think, so this is late in the story, at the end of the narrative. I mean, I feel like I shouldn't be answering this, because my book's not even published yet, I'm not the expert. I don't know, perhaps you could have a hint earlier on. You would use the first person in your prologue and epilogue, so it's not a surprise at the end. And I also think if you use the first person, but the first person is kind of an I in the sense that it's looking as well as an I. You know, the focus is on your subject, not on yourself. So perhaps that means that that's right. I'm hoping so.
Yeah, I think so many of these kinds of things, there's a little bit question of voice, I guess, and style, and the kind of the gaining of trust, the gaining of the reader's trust. And I think, yeah, that, you know, as they were saying earlier, a biography is there in every single sentence, you know, whether or not that's made explicit. And I guess, yeah, if I were writing a book which was mostly the third person, but I became a character at the end, I think I would foreground that at the beginning. Yeah, as Nina was saying, like the sort of ethnography to kind of lay out your stake in the narrative. Otherwise, I think it would be rather odd if the reader suddenly realised you've sort of been there all along. But I think, yeah, I think it's just something in the voice ultimately that's hard to convey. It's something that you kind of get in the writing, I guess.
I agree with Francesca. I think we solved it.
And also, if you're lucky enough to have been on the spot, it's at that point in the life that you want to write about, you have gold in hand and you need to lead with it. And on that note, I wish you all and everyone in this room good luck with their unconventional lives.
Yeah, this is so many questions.